The map trembled in Adolf Hitler's left hand. Not from emotion, though there was plenty of that in the Reich Chancellery bunker on the last day of January 1945. The tremor was constant now, a rhythmic shake that made the thin paper flutter like a trapped moth. He was 55 years old and looked 70, his face gray, his body bent, his eyes carrying the glassy shine of someone who slept in 2-hour fragments and woke to nightmares that were indistinguishable from his waking hours. The map showed the Oder River, a thin blue line running north to south through the heart of what remained of the Reich. And on that map, red arrows pointed west. Soviet armies, massive and unstoppable, had crossed the Vistula weeks before, had torn through Poland and East Prussia like a scythe through wheat, and now they had reached the Oder at Kustrin, barely 60 kilometers from Berlin. 60 kilometers. The distance a man could walk in a day. The distance the Red Army could cover in hours once they decided to move. General Theodor Buss delivered the news in the bunker's conference room, his voice flat, professional, drained of everything except the facts. The First Belarusian Front under Marshal Georgy Zhukov had established bridgeheads on the western bank. The First Ukrainian Front under Marshal Ivan Konev was doing the same to the south. Soviet engineers were already throwing pontoon bridges across the ice-choked water. The Oder line, the last major geographical barrier before Berlin, had been breached. Hitler stared at the map for a long moment, his right hand gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles went white. The tremor in his left hand intensified. Then he looked up at Busse, and the general later told interrogators that what he saw in those eyes was not fear, not even anger exactly, but something worse. A kind of affronted disbelief, as though reality itself had committed an act of personal betrayal. "Impossible," Hitler said. His voice was hoarse, weakened by years of shouting, but it still carried the edge of absolute authority. "The Oder cannot be crossed. I ordered it held." Buss said nothing. There was nothing to say. The Oder had been crossed. Soviet tanks were already on the western bank. These were facts, and facts had stopped mattering in this bunker weeks ago. Hitler's gaze moved to Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces High Command, a man whose primary qualification for his position was his willingness to agree with everything Hitler said. Keitel stood ramrod straight in his immaculate uniform, his face carefully blank. "Where is Himmler?" Hitler demanded. He had given Heinrich Himmler command of Army Group Vistula just weeks before, despite Himmler having no military training whatsoever, despite every professional officer in the Wehrmacht knowing it was insane. Himmler commanded the SS and Hitler trusted the SS. That was the logic, if logic still meant anything. "The Reichsführer SS is establishing his headquarters," Keitel said carefully. "He is organizing the defenses." Organizing. Hitler repeated the word like it was something foul. "The Soviets are across the Oder, and he is organizing." His voice rose. "I gave him an army. I gave him divisions." "Where are they? Where are the counterattacks I ordered?" The question hung in the stale air of the bunker. Outside, in the real world, the answer was simple. The divisions Hitler spoke of existed primarily on paper. Army Group Vistula was a collection of shattered units, undertrained Volkssturm militia, boys and old men with rifles and no ammunition, tank battalions with no tanks, artillery batteries with no shells. The Wehrmacht that had conquered Europe was gone, bled out in Russia, ground down in Normandy, encircled and destroyed in the Ardennes. What remained was a ghost army commanded by a man who had never commanded anything larger than a filing cabinet. But in the bunker, truth had become negotiable. So Keitel said, "The counterattacks are being prepared, my Führer. The situation is being stabilized." Hitler turned back to the map. His finger, shaking, traced the red arrows pushing west from the Oder. "They must be thrown back," he said. "Every meter of ground must be held. Every bridge must be destroyed. The Oder line is the shield of Berlin. It cannot fall." It had already fallen. Everyone in the room knew it. The Soviets had 2.2 million men massed along the Oder, thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of artillery pieces. Against them, the Germans could scrape together perhaps 400,000 troops, most of them exhausted, poorly equipped, and increasingly convinced that the war was lost. The mathematics were not complicated. But Hitler was not doing mathematics. He was doing something else, something that had sustained him through 5.5 years of war, and was now sustaining him through its collapse. He was willing reality to conform to his orders. He had always believed, with the fervor of a prophet, that will could overcome material fact. It had worked in 1940, when his generals had told him France could not be beaten in 6 weeks, and he had proven them wrong. It had worked 100 times since, until it stopped working, until the laws of physics and logistics and human endurance reasserted themselves. But he could not accept that it had stopped working. To accept that would be to accept that everything, all of it, had been for nothing. "I want Steiner's attack launched immediately," Hitler said. SS Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner commanded what Hitler called an army group, but what actually consisted of a few scattered divisions. He will strike north from the Oder, cut off Zhukov's spearheads, and restore the line. Steiner's forces were nowhere near strong enough to cut off anything. They barely had enough fuel to move. But Hitler had decided it would happen, so it would happen. "Yes, my Führer," Keitel said. The conference continued for another hour. Hitler issued orders for units that no longer existed to attack positions that had already fallen. He demanded rivers be held that the enemy had crossed days ago. He spoke of wonder weapons that would turn the tide, of jet aircraft that would sweep the skies clear, of new tank divisions being formed in the west that would march east and smash the Soviet armies against the Oder. None of it was real. All of it was necessary, because the alternative was to look at the map and see what was actually there. A noose tightening around Berlin, and at the center of that noose, this bunker, and in this bunker, him. When the conference ended and the generals filed out, Hitler remained at the table, staring at the map. His secretaries, watching from the doorway, saw him lean forward, his face close to the paper, as though he could change what it showed through sheer proximity. Traudl Junge, his youngest secretary, later wrote that she had never seen him look so old, so diminished, so utterly alone. But then he straightened, and when he turned to face them, his expression had changed. The rage was gone. In its place was something harder to read, something almost serene. "They think they have won," he said, speaking to no one in particular. "They think because they have reached the Oder, they have reached Berlin. They do not understand. Berlin is not a city. It is an idea, and ideas cannot be conquered by tanks." It was the kind of thing he had been saying for months, the mystical rhetoric that had replaced strategic thinking. His secretaries nodded. Because that was what you did. You nodded, you agreed, you pretended that the words meant something. The next day, February 1st, Soviet forces expanded their bridgeheads across the Oder. Zhukov's engineers worked around the clock, building bridges strong enough to support the T-34 tanks that would lead the final assault on Berlin. The ice on the river was breaking up, making the crossings more difficult, but the Soviets had learned their trade in a hard school. They knew how to build bridges under fire, how to move armies across rivers, how to keep supplies flowing forward even as the Germans threw everything they had left at the crossing points. And the Germans did throw everything. Luftwaffe pilots, flying obsolete aircraft on fumes, dove at the bridges and were swatted from the sky by Soviet anti-aircraft fire. Artillery batteries, firing their last shells, tried to collapse the pontoons and succeeded only in churning up the water. Volkssturm units, old men and boys with Panzerfausts, crept toward the bridgeheads at night and were cut down by Soviet machine guns. The Oder line was not abandoned without a fight. It was simply that the fight was hopeless, and everyone except the man in the bunker knew it. In the bunker, Hitler's rage grew. When reports came in of Soviet advances, he blamed his generals. When generals reported that units could not attack because they lacked ammunition, he blamed the generals for poor planning. When they reported that units could not attack because the units did not exist, he accused them of defeatism, of cowardice, of treason. The word treason came up often now. It was his explanation for everything. The war was not being lost because the enemy was stronger. It was being lost because his subordinates were betraying him. He summoned Himmler to the bunker and demanded to know why Army Group Vistula had failed to hold the Oder. Himmler, who had spent the past weeks in a state of barely controlled panic, fumbled through an explanation involving Soviet superiority in numbers and the difficulty of coordinating scattered units. Hitler cut him off. "Excuses," he said. "I gave you an army. You lost it. That is treason." Himmler went pale. The word treason from Hitler's mouth was a death sentence, but Hitler did not pursue it. He needed Himmler, needed the SS, needed the illusion that someone, somewhere, was still loyal. So he let it drop, and Himmler fled the bunker as quickly as dignity allowed, and Hitler turned back to his maps. The maps were covered with symbols now, neat little rectangles and triangles representing divisions and corps that existed only in Hitler's mind. Staff officers updated them daily, adding new units, moving old ones, creating on paper the army that reality had taken away. It was a kind of fiction, a collaborative delusion, and everyone participated because the alternative was to tell Hitler the truth, and the truth would kill him. Or it would kill them. It was hard to say which. Albert Speer, the Reich's armaments minister, and one of the few men who still dared speak honestly to Hitler, visited the bunker in early February. He found Hitler hunched over the maps, moving pins with his trembling hand, muttering to himself about counterattacks and encirclements. Speer watched for a moment, then cleared his throat. "My Führer, we need to discuss the evacuation of Berlin's civilians." Hitler looked up, his eyes focusing slowly. "Evacuation? The Soviets are 60 kilometers away. When they attack, the city will become a battlefield. The civilians should be moved west to safety." Hitler's face darkened. "There will be no evacuation. Berlin will be defended. Every man, woman, and child will fight." "My Führer, most of them are not soldiers. They are families, children." "Then they will learn to be soldiers." Hitler's voice was rising again. "Do you think I care about their comfort? Do you think I care if they suffer? Germany has proven itself weak. Germany has failed me. If the people cannot defend their capital, they deserve to perish with it." Speer stared at him. This was new, this open contempt for the German people. Hitler had always spoken of himself as Germany's savior, the champion of the folk. But now, faced with defeat, the mask was slipping. The people had not lived up to his vision, and so they were expendable. "See," Speer said quietly. He left the bunker that day knowing he would not return. Later, he would write that the man he saw in February 1945 was not the man he had known. That man was gone, replaced by something hollow and venomous, a shell animated only by rage and spite. But Hitler was not entirely delusional. In his clearer moments, he understood what was coming. He knew the Red Army would not stop at the Oder. He knew Berlin would be surrounded, attacked, probably taken. What he could not accept was what would happen to him personally. He spoke often, in those final weeks, of fighting to the last, of dying in the ruins of the Reich chancellery, of never surrendering. It was the one thing he was consistent about. He would not be captured. He would not be paraded through Moscow in chains. He would not face trial. He would die first, and he would take as many others with him as he could. The orders he issued reflected this. On February 3rd, he commanded that all bridges in Berlin be prepared for demolition. If the Soviets entered the city, they would find nothing but rubble. He ordered factories destroyed, power plants demolished, food stores burned. Germany, if it could not be his, would be no one's. Speer, appalled, quietly countermanded many of these orders, saving what infrastructure he could. But Hitler's intent was clear. This would not be a strategic retreat. It would be an apocalypse. In the bunker's conference room, the daily briefings became increasingly surreal. Officers reported on battles that had already been lost, on units that had ceased to exist, on plans that could not be executed. Hitler listened, nodded, issued new orders that contradicted the old ones, then forgot what he had said and issued contradictory orders again an hour later. His staff learned to smile, to agree, to write everything down and then do whatever seemed least insane. Gerhard Bolt, a young officer assigned to brief Hitler on the Eastern Front, later described the experience as like speaking to someone underwater. Hitler would stare at him, his eyes glassy, his face slack, and Bolt would wonder if the Führer was even hearing him. Then Hitler would explode into rage over some minor detail, some unit that had retreated without permission, some general who had questioned an order. The rage would burn itself out in minutes, leaving Hitler exhausted, slumped in his chair, his hand shaking uncontrollably. He was a ruin, Bolt wrote after the war. Not just physically, though that was bad enough. His whole being was a ruin. He could not think clearly, could not plan, could not accept reality. He lived in a world of his own creation, and in that world, Germany was still winning. But even in that world, the Oder crossing was a problem. Hitler returned to it obsessively, demanding updates, ordering counterattacks, insisting that Zhukov's bridgeheads be eliminated. When reports came in that the counterattacks had failed, he blamed the UNR commanders. When new commanders were appointed and their attacks failed too, he blamed them. The pattern repeated until there were no more commanders to blame, no more units to throw away. By mid-February, the Soviets had consolidated their positions along the Oder. Zhukov's forces held a solid front from the Baltic coast to the Neisse River in the south. They were not advancing yet, not pushing toward Berlin. Stalin had ordered them to wait, to build up supplies, to prepare for the final assault. But they were there. 60 kilometers away, and everyone in Berlin could feel them. The city's population, already battered by years of bombing, began to panic. Those with connections fled west. Those without connections hunkered down and waited. In the bunker, Hitler's world contracted further. He stopped going outside, even to the Chancellery garden. He stopped meeting with anyone except his immediate staff. His days blurred together, an endless cycle of conferences, rages, and fitful sleep. His health deteriorated visibly. The tremor in his left hand spread to his left leg. He walked with a shuffle, his back bent, his gaze fixed on the floor. His secretaries whispered that he looked like a ghost haunting his own life. But he still gave orders. On February 16th, he declared that any soldier who retreated without orders would be executed. On February 20th, he ordered the formation of new divisions to defend Berlin. Divisions that would be scraped together from training schools, administrative units, and anyone else who could hold a rifle. On February 25th, he announced that Berlin would never surrender, that it would be defended street by street, house by house, room by room. The orders were issued with the same absolute authority he had always commanded, but now, increasingly, they were ignored. Generals nodded, agreed, and then did what they thought might actually work. Units retreated when they needed to, regardless of orders. Civilians fled when they could, regardless of prohibitions. The machinery of the Reich was breaking down, and Hitler's will, which had once held it together, was no longer enough. On the Oder, the Soviets waited. They were in no hurry. They had learned, through 4 years of brutal war, that patience saved lives. They would attack when they were ready, when their supplies were stocked, when their plans were perfect, and when they attacked, they would not stop until they reached the Reich Chancellery. Hitler knew this. In his clearer moments, he knew it with perfect clarity. The war was lost. Germany was finished. All that remained was the manner of the ending, and he had decided on his ending. He would stay in Berlin, He would fight to the last, and when the end came, he would take his own life rather than face capture. He spoke of this openly now to his secretaries, to his adjutants, to anyone who would listen. "I will never leave Berlin," he said. "I will die here. That is my destiny." His staff, listening, felt a chill. He was not speaking metaphorically. He meant it literally. He had already begun planning his suicide, discussing methods, making arrangements. The bunker, which had been built as a command center, was becoming a tomb. But even as he planned his death, he could not stop giving orders, could not stop pretending that the war could still be won. It was as though two Hitlers existed simultaneously, the one who knew the truth and was preparing to die, and the one who still believed in miracles and issued impossible commands. The two Hitlers coexisted uneasily, sometimes in the same conversation, sometimes in the same sentence. "The Oder line must be restored," he told his generals on March 1st. "Steiner's attack will cut off the Soviet bridgeheads. The enemy will be thrown back." Then, in the same breath, almost as an afterthought, "And if we fail, if Berlin falls, then Germany deserves to perish. We will burn it all." The generals exchanged glances. There was nothing to say. They saluted, left the bunker, and went back to trying to manage a catastrophe with no tools and no time. March came, and the Soviets still waited on the Oder. In the bunker, Hitler's rages became more frequent, more intense, more detached from reality. He screamed at maps, at officers, at the walls. He wept, though his staff pretended not to notice. He issued orders and then forgot them, then issued contradictory orders and forgot those too. The tremor in his hand became a constant shaking that made it impossible for him to write. His secretaries had to transcribe his words, which came in disjointed fragments, half-finished thoughts that trailed off into silence. And through it all, the question that had started everything, the question that had brought his world crashing down, echoed in the bunker's concrete corridors. "The Red Army has crossed the Oder. What now?" Hitler's answer, delivered in rage and denial and impossible orders, was this: "We fight. We hold. We never surrender." Reality, in the form of 2.2 million Soviet soldiers, had a different answer. But that answer would take another 2 months to deliver. 2 months of fighting and dying and burning. 2 months that would end in a bunker in Berlin with a gunshot and a body burning in a shell crater. But on that day in late January, when the news first came that the Oder had been crossed, Hitler's response was simpler, more direct, more revealing of the man he had become. He looked at the map, at the red arrows pointing toward his capital, and he said the only thing he could say, the only thing he had left to say: "Impossible. I ordered it held." And in that moment, in that one word, the entire edifice of Nazi Germany was laid bare. Not a nation, not an ideology, not a movement, just one man's will, colliding with reality and shattering.